Thank you so much for joining us today for the California offshore wind role in a just energy transition. I'm really excited to be here with this panel, and I think it's going to be a fantastic conversation building on a lot of the key points we've heard this afternoon. My name is Hillary Bright. I am the U.S. Vice President for Xodus Group here in the United States, and I'm really looking forward to the panel as it ultimately brings together leaders and change makers for environmental justice communities across California. Environmental justice communities are often impacted by new industries, major developments, projects from multiple angles, both positive and negative. These communities often provide the workforce, the geographic location for infrastructure, and in past cases, some of the first to be disproportionately bear the burden of environmental and economic development in these projects. In the panel, it's clear, we're here today to talk about this massive opportunity near term in California, floating offshore wind. With millions and eventually billions of dollars over the coming decades being invested in the region, it's really critical that we have a holistic, informed approach to distributional justice for communities in Humboldt, Morro Bay, the Central Coast, and other regions. In preparation with the panelists, and as we've heard today, stated by Frankie Myers and Violet Sage Walker, the how of the development process is really what matters here. And I think this panel will help to really uncover what some of those pitfalls might be, but some of the massive opportunities we have when we try to get this right. So very quickly, I will introduce just the panelists' name and the organization they work for, and the questions. I think get an opportunity to dig into a bit more detail on who they are and what their stories are. So first, I've got Ganion, the Executive Director of Brightline Defense, a nonprofit that bridges policy and legal advocacy to ensure that workforce and environmental policies benefit local, underserved, and low-income communities. Jana Ganion, from Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for Blue Lake Rancheria, California, a federally recognized Native American tribe in northwestern California, supporting hundreds of local jobs, government operations and programs, economic diversification, resilience and sustainability efforts, environmental protection, and a wide array of social services. And certainly last but not least, Lucia Marquez, the Associate Policy Director at the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, or CAUSE, a community-based organization that advances the political and civic empowerment of the Asia-Pacific American community through voter outreach, training, education, and leadership development. So I think you quickly get a sense here that have a really interesting, I think, cross-section of conversations, and would really love to just kick off the first conversation to you all. As you're thinking about distributional injustices, often placing the burden of development, and especially thinking even electricity production on low-income and minority communities, I would love to hear and share with the audience a little bit more about the legacy of environmental justice in communities you've worked, and what are those challenges that your organizations are developing or are addressing right now in California, so we kind of lay the baseline for what are some of the key things we want to avoid as we're thinking about this massive opportunity in offshore wind. Eddie, I can kick it off to you to start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Eddie on, again, with Brightline, and to maybe describe our nonprofit and how we interact with offshore wind. We're a policy nonprofit, and environmental justice is often our theme in everything that we do. And part of the way we look at our services, for instance, whether it's job training or quality monitoring, informs our worldview, as well as the partnerships that we often build with local communities as we look at something like offshore wind. And it's, the challenges in the North Coast and Central Coast are very different from each other, and thinking through the challenges not just in implementing these projects, but around the surrounding communities and how and if they'll come to accept them will be part of it. So there are a lot of procedural justice issues that need to be worked out, meaning in terms of community stakeholder engagement alone, to have these conversations ongoing with developers will be really important.
Great. Jana, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. So it's wonderful to be here, and I chose my outfit specifically to coordinate with the chair. One of the legacy in our region, in the Redwood region, behind the Redwood curtain, really includes a couple of key points that inform where we need to go from here. We heard earlier from Vice Chair Myers and Chair Violet Sage Walker that some of these, and we've had in our region the gold rush, the timber rush, the land rush, wealth extraction, water extraction. We've had the cannabis industry boom and bust. And we've had several, at the time, really good energy strategies actually turn out to be really bad ideas. So the nuclear power plant that went in, one of the first commercial nuclear power plants in the United States, is in Eureka. Cost $33 million to build. It's cost $1 billion, well over $1 billion and counting, to decommission and make safe. And that's a lodestone around our community's neck for the next 100,000 years. We also have one of the largest dam removals in the world happening in our region, led by the Karuk, Kupa, Yurok tribes. And so I think when we talk about equity and a just transition and just implementation, these things are not just lists, they're real to us. And from the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe's perspective, what we're working on is capacity to learn about this new industry cluster. It's not just the wind farms, it's everything else that's with it. So capacity is what we're working on now. And we know that all of that happens within a backstop of the climate crisis. So we don't have the choice of doing nothing. We have to do something. This has really good potential, but as you said, the how matters. It has to be done well.
Okay. Lucia.
It's really great to be here. I think there was a slight mix-up with the titles of the organizations. I represent CAUSE, the Central Coast Alliance for Sustainable Economy. We're based in Ventura and Santa Barbara County, where we really work and do base building with community members on the front lines of issues around environmental justice, the housing crisis, and also workers' rights, and uplifting immigrant workers who are really the communities who really bear the cost of these intersectional issues of living through the housing crisis, but also living near a power plant, and also, experiencing worker violations by being farm workers who work in the fields, where agriculture is a really large industry in the Central Coast. One of the core cities that CAUSE works in is the city of Oxnard. It's one of the largest cities in the Central Coast between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And when we think about our energy economy, we know that it's communities of color who have been bearing the biggest burden of energy production. But we like to remind people to think of these communities and how they experience impacts in a cumulative way. Oxnard, as an example, is home to 3 gas-fired power plants, but also home to an EPA Superfund site, neighboring to the Port of Hueneme that moves hundreds and hundreds of diesel trucks through residential neighborhoods every single day. There's heavy pesticide use in this neighborhood as well. And so when we think about the lived experience of someone that lives in a community like Oxnard, their asthma isn't just from living next to a power plant. It's this toxic soup that they live in and they live and breathe every day. And those are the types of things that cut people's lives short. And we're seeing that in our communities.
Thank you, Lucia. You were very gracious for the way you handled that, and I should be fired as your moderator. So thank you for making that smooth. I think that's really helpful in giving an idea of sort of how you're all sort of coming at this space. And so thinking on what are the core opportunities moving forward, what are some sort of principles that you all think about in terms of meaningful engagement in your communities and sort of the expectations that you hold stakeholders in the industry to approaching, whether it's state, federal, private industry, and sort of what does successful engagement look like to you all? I'll let anyone who wants to dive in.
I mean, it's having these conversations now. I think communities that we're talking about, frontline communities of color, they haven't had a seat at the table, and so as we're talking about this development, this new industry in California, where especially around decision making around energy production in California, those decisions are made so far removed from community. They're often in these legal proceedings that are really complex and difficult to access if you're not a lawyer or you don't have a lawyer that represents you or your community or your organization. And so I think it's about starting these conversations now. And I think, and in addition to that, some of the core values is like, let's have conversations and meet people where they're at. Let's have them in accessible languages, in indigenous languages. Let's be sharing information. I think if this group is really great, they're seeing so many people that are so engaged, and this is just like a fraction of the community across the entire state that we represent. And if we're not bringing community in and actively seeking those opportunities, there's going to be so many people that are left out once this industry starts to boom and develop.
We run the risk of repeating the same sort of challenges and bad practices that have been developed in sort of in the past. And I think, you know, one of the things in seeing in the Inflation Reduction Act, right, there are tax provisions for community benefits, which ideally are to sort of help support and drive that meaningful community engagement and to be more as business as usual for the industry. Instead of, we all hope everyone will function in the best way possible and we'll consider all of these things, but you know, the federal government trying to really think about how do we incentivize that practice. Do you see opportunities sort of with the key local, state, federal policy to incentivize and take advantage of that opportunity in your communities?
You want to talk?
I think what we see in the Inflation Reduction Act is an institutionalization of community benefit requirements and mandates. So when we talk about community benefits, which I'm also part of an initiative in Humboldt that is incubated at the Humboldt Area Foundation, Wild Rivers Community Foundation, called the Core Hub, the Redwood Region Climate Community Resilience Hub. Rolls off the tongue.
Right.
So we know that these projects are big. As we were talking about yesterday, just the port project alone in Humboldt would be enough for the community to engage with and the tribal nations to engage with. But we have 4 or 5 industry projects of that size coming at us all at once. And I think what the Inflation Reduction Act and other policy supports of that kind is saying, you know, it's not just the projects, it's projects plus. It's projects plus real community benefits that allow us to lean into the local and deliver tangible, real outcomes that people can have confidence in, that they're not just going to be flyover places. So, you know, just running 500 kV transmission lines over these rural, remote, tribal nations to get to load centers is not a formula for success this time around. Yep. So I think that's one of the things that we're seeing.
Yeah, Eddie, please.
2 more things to flag, and Jana and I were talking about this backstage, that BOEM even incorporated community benefits as part of its auction design was a step in the right direction. It did move the needle and understanding of what these projects can bring to local communities. But also upcoming, you know, I've heard loud and clear throughout this conference that procurement is very much on the minds of many of the developers and folks really into this industry, and that tying community benefits to that discussion does seem to be important as well, as it has been in the past in New York, where there is an expectation, I think, that once you set the target and then the purchasing, you know, kind of drive around this industry, that as a result, what does a community get out of it will be an ongoing discussion, I think. And so making sure that's continuing to be part of the conversation will be important.
Jana, I'm actually going to come back to you for a second as well. There are aspects of the industry where indigenous knowledge, I think we heard a little bit about this earlier in the afternoon, is especially valuable and can be leveraged for sort of benefit of the region. How do you sort of see some of those origins and how you think about things really playing into the development of offshore wind and how we think about this?
I think we're seeing a much more workable relationship between tribal nations and state agencies in particular to incorporate tribal science and tribal ecological knowledge. We've seen it in the evolution of the California climate studies and other things that tribes are leading or co-partnering in those kinds of efforts. And that's critical because like we've seen with the Karuk tribe, for example. Tribes are leading in applying tribal science, tribal ecological knowledge into these severe problems of our day, and we marginalize that and ignore that at our peril. It's one of the reasons we're here, is that marginalization of those ways of doing things. And I also think that, going forward, from an economic development standpoint, we talk a lot about environmental and ecosystem adaptive management in this space. Tribal nations that we've talked with, and each tribal nation is different, and I do not speak for tribal nations as a whole, but I can report out on what has been told to me, that tribal nations see this ecosystem management as one example where tribal science and these ways of knowing can actually lead the way that we do the economic development pieces around the ecosystem management. And it's also, by the way, careers and jobs that tribal members are excited about. These are the career classes that actually thread that needle. And I would though caution that it's justice beyond jobs. That Blue Lake Rancheria Tribal Council has stated, tribal members do not want to be the truck drivers this time around. They want to own the logistics companies. And I think that's an important piece to this, that part of the extraction and part of the reason that there may be opposition to this kind of clean energy build-out is in part because the wealth has been extracted, the expertise has been extracted and exploited to some degree. So we have a chance to actually even out the boom and bust cycles here with real strategies that will only happen through public and private partnerships. So it's an exciting time for that.
Yeah, no, and it's the opportunity to create not just jobs, but to create careers, which ideally then can deal with a little bit of that boom and bust as well. And obviously, as we're looking for different approaches to developing this industry in ways that we're not repeating the past, it seems like listening to some of those tried and true, baseline approaches of thinking about the ecological basis first and then developing around that. Definitely something in a diversity of opinions that I think we're all, diversity of opinions, diversity of people as we're trying to develop this industry are all really valuable and getting us to a different endpoint than maybe we've landed in previous energy development. Lucia and Eddie, so now I've heard from Jana on this thinking, are there parallels sort of with local knowledge from your communities that you think can also sort of add into how we just change the way we're thinking about developing this new massive industry?
If it's okay, I'd like to drill down maybe a bit on workforce development policy.
Please.
And I agree, justice beyond jobs is a really important part. Oftentimes, there's with major development projects, there's often a feeling, well, the wealth just trickles down, and then there are restaurants that will be sprouting up and economic corridors that will come, and then, look, we have a great sustainable economy. That's usually not the case in particularly projects of this kind of scale. If you look at utility scale solar, I think that has been a challenge where you have extremely rural, still impoverished communities right next to these gleaming infrastructure projects. And you don't want that to happen with something like offshore wind. The opportunities are just too tremendous. So thinking through workforce development policy, the nuances of, say, local hiring, perhaps even targeted hiring, for instance, like looking at specific communities or by zip code perhaps, and where people would want access to these jobs would be important. And then thinking through like community colleges or academic institutions. And then, of course, community-based organizations, for instance, if there are pre-apprenticeship programs that exist to do the outreach, to get people interested in this as a future career, that's all important groundwork to lay down now, because the training path is not like people turn into hard hat workers overnight. That's not a reality of workforce development. It's a long training pathway, and I think the beauty of particularly the construction trades is if you're, a union apprentice journeying out, that you can earn decent middle-class wages, and to have that be delivered to local communities in a way that's meaningful to them is really important. So having those policy frameworks and also having the training dollars, the training systems built up are really important.
Yeah, I think Eddie spoke to that really well, and really like uplift both what was shared, and I think from thinking through the perspective of the community members that we represent, it's really easy to feel like, like I don't really have something to add or to share to this conversation because there's just so much technical expertise, because it's such a technical process. And I think for us, what we always try to uplift is like people's lived experiences inform so much, and so when thinking about workforce development and how to build out this new workforce, going to, like how Eddie was saying, community colleges and finding community where they're at, and reaching and connecting with community-based organizations so that they could share those resources, build out those partnerships. I think oftentimes a lot of these like really great union jobs that are developed, thinking about like longshoremen and port work, there's amazing jobs that exist within that industry, and also could be really hard to get into those jobs. And how do we build out a workforce that is inclusive and opens up opportunities for someone who is the son or daughter of a farm worker in Santa Maria to be able to like get their foot in the door and work and build a career in offshore wind. That's something that if you were to talk about that in our communities right now, feels so out of reach, and so I think it's just really connecting with people and really uplifting lived experiences, expertise, especially in communities who have been polluted for decades and decades. And so I think on that note, really looking to community expertise around how do we best mitigate pollution reduction, and how do we bring in those benefits to communities that are going to be hosting a lot of the maintenance and the port storage. How do we prioritize what we're cleaning up in pollution reduction, and how do we create that priority list through community engagement and something that community members are saying that they want, and it's going to be things that community members have been fighting for and asking for years.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a wealth of information in workforce in general, and I think as we know what it's going to take to truly be prepared for offshore wind, just in terms of the infrastructure. It's going to take the entire massive state of California to pull together the assets and the resources that are there in various communities to kind of make it all work. So from your perspectives, and we'd love to hear from all of you on this from different communities, sort of what do you feel like those major opportunities are for your community specifically as it relates to offshore wind? Everyone, I think, has their key space in the market and can certainly fit in here. So how do you all think about that?
I can go. Well, so the Port of Humboldt will be part of the mix, and that development is actually going forward right now. The Harbor District is hard at work trying to get this underway, and I think so that's one piece of it. I think that is going to be a $700 million to $1 billion project, and in that. The Harbor District really came out early and said, our constituencies have told us that we need to preserve the high health of Humboldt Bay. Yep. We see ports all over California fighting tooth and nail to get down to zero emission, all electric. We see it in San Diego. It's actually a success story. We see it in Long Beach with their ambitious goals, and I think what we're hearing from the community is, a benefit would be that we could have a world-class port that everyone would look to say, oh, that's how you do it, right? So that's underway. I think the other thing about our region is energy equity, directly related to offshore wind as well, where we have a single point of failure with a natural gas power plant that sits south of Eureka. On December 20th of last year, 2022, a 6.4 earthquake happened in the region and immediately took the power plant out. The whole county where they didn't have backup emergency power was out of power, and that can happen at any time for us, and it could last for weeks. So we see the offshore wind industry cluster, and that includes transmission and all of these other things, as a real chance for us to create some clean energy transition and some redundancy and resiliency in our energy sector that actually, again, is not just a tick box. This is a real need we have. It takes our legs out quite often, and we need to improve it. And then there are tribal nations that still do not have access to the electrical grid, and have never had access to the electrical grid. The rural electrification of the 1930s passed them by completely. So we have a chance to do this maybe not directly related, but parallel investments in tribal nations through things like microgrids and other solutions. But that also could be a part of the transmission build out or a part of this other build out. And again, I'll just say on one point about the natural gas. Not only is it a single point of failure, it provides most of our electrons, and it's 40 times the carbon footprint of offshore wind energy. And that is a white paper that was just published by the DOE. Okay. So there's some real advantages to it. Again, we need to be careful and cautious because there were real advantages to nuclear as well. But I think that we have some real problems to solve, and this presents an opportunity for that.
Lucia?
I mean, I think that there's some really great opportunities to also consider to clean up some dirty fossil fuel infrastructure that exists. Within the Central Coast, it's one of the most polluted coastlines from a legacy of offshore oil. And so, I think that being a community benefit that's prioritized and considered as we're going to develop more on our coastline, how are we going to clean up and get rid of that dirty infrastructure? We've seen time and time again, polluted sites just be abandoned. Companies will file bankruptcy. They can just walk away from their power plant and just sits there, and the community is now responsible. And so I think that's something that we really want to be seen, considered, and prioritized. And also, how are we going to be able to put some of these dirty fossil fuel energy structures, like how are we going to retire those, and how are we going to prioritize those to get retired? I think EJ communities, they've been through enough. And I think pinky promises of like, oh, that one will get shut down. It'll come next year, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. That's what has been told to community and promised. And I think offshore wind is going to open up the opportunity for energy reliability. And how do we take that opportunity to correct the wrongs, and correct those wrongs in the places that have been wronged the most? And so I think those are some things that I would really want to start off with, and that being a baseline.
Right. Eddie?
Well, I really believe in the larger energy vision that the state of California is putting itself on to get to 100% renewable energy, and that the state hopefully shouldn't be that reliant ultimately on peaker power plants, for instance, just to make sure the lights don't go off as they almost did last summer. And so part of our work, historically at Brightline has been, for instance, shutting down a fossil fuel power plant that existed in Potrero Hill, and then thinking through the larger historical arc of can we get to clean energy that hopefully is reliable enough, serves the grid enough so that we can retire a lot of those plants, or at the bare minimum, not fire them up every time we have an energy crisis on our hands. So yeah, battery plays a large part of that as well. And so, I think a lot of this will be determined by local communities at the end of the day. And that's why, for instance, the city of Morro Bay and the proposed battery storage project, like watching that very closely to see how the community grapples with it. And if it's, essentially acceptable to local interest groups will be, I think, a part of the upcoming challenge.
Great, that's really helpful. And I'm curious, as economies are changing, I feel like across the world, and are you seeing in communities sort of shrinking opportunities that potentially offshore wind can help to fill and present some of those new opportunities? Obviously, we talk about transitioning to a low carbon kind of future and seeing the transition from oil and gas, and certainly skills that can be transitioned there into the offshore environment. Are there places like this that not only can offshore wind done right create new opportunities, potentially places that can fill some gaps that are now maybe plaguing the community now?
Well, opportunities for like clean infrastructure, so ports again come to mind, like the ability to build an all-electric port, I think is possible with the combination of federal and state monies, but that's one policy point I'd focus on.
Yeah.
For others. Yeah.
I think just to build on that a little bit, what you were saying, Lucia, a part of the location for the heavy lift terminal that is being built at Humboldt is actually exactly that story. The pulp mill company disappeared in the middle of the night in the harbor district, and the community was left to clean up millions of gallons of toxic liquors, among other things, and that's still going on, and it's been a decade, well over a decade now. So it has the opportunity to do some of those things, to revitalize in that way. And then I also think we're talking overall with the IIJA, the Inflation Reduction Act. We're talking about infrastructure-driven economic development.
Yep.
For the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe, for example, that really fills a crucial need. The infrastructure needs are real in tribal nations, and that not just energy, it's water, it's wastewater, it's broadband, all of these things.
Yep.
And I think it also presents an opportunity to look at those things holistically, to really create not only an economic development because of the infrastructure projects, but using that infrastructure, designing it in a way that actually is economy enabling for the future. So if it's done in the right way, we've seen this with the microgrids in specific situations. If it's done in the right way, that is really, not only does it serve its purpose for infrastructure, clean, reliable, but it actually enables economies to thrive and grow. And that's what I think part of the goal is overall for this kind of effort.
Be a true catalyst for other things, right? It's like those are the foundational pieces of a lot of businesses need that kind of infrastructure. So it's really that catalyst opportunity.
Right.
Lucia, any other thoughts sort of from you on this?
Well, earlier when Eddie was talking about how to build up our workforce development and do these really localized hire, looking at zip codes that are disadvantaged zip codes, what we're seeing in our communities is like communities are living through a housing crisis, and so like communities are absolutely shrinking. People can no longer afford to live here, and so communities are hit by so many things: pollution. Like lack of jobs, their rents going up every single month. And so I think there's going to be so many benefits across the board in terms of air pollution reduction, addressing climate, energy reliability, all amazing things. But being able to build out an economy that truly benefits people like in these rural areas, that targets job hires and job development and these rural low-income communities of color, that's going to keep our communities to be able to stay living where they live, to be able to work where they live, and to be able to afford it, and to really hopefully be able to get ourselves out of this housing crisis, which is so real. And I think what I was spoke to in the beginning, it's really looking at these cumulative impacts and these intersectional impacts that are hitting communities, because that's the lived experience, that's the reality.
And I think I'm going to stay with you for 1 second, because you made a point earlier that I think is really important about some of these opportunities feeling like they're far off, like they're not even within reach for people to aim for. And so thinking about some of those barriers to entry for some of these opportunities. So whether that's education, whether that's childcare, whatever those, I would love to hear a little bit more about sort of the barriers to entry, because getting the workforce programs right is going to be critical. And we've seen certainly through a long history of federal and state spending, some work really well, some not so well. But this is a key part, I think, of developing the industry. One, because we need the workforce to be able to accomplish this. And two, if we want to actually achieve the benefits that we see from potential economic development, we need to break down some of these barriers to entry for folks to engage. And so So from any of you, please feel free to kick off. But Lucia, you mentioned that first. I'd love to hear sort of how you're thinking about how do we get folks into these pathways?
I mean, I think starting, I mean, we're probably like years away from like a lot of this starting, right? And so I think with workforce development, I think Eddie mentioned like pre-apprentice programs, is being able to start training a workforce like young and be able to build off of that and get communities built up to that, I think is a really great strategy that would address that. But also like looking at the demographics of our communities, like within the Central Coast, it's, you know, it's a really large agricultural community where, you know, large households of like mainly Spanish speaking homes and a lot of indigenous communities live throughout the Central Coast. And I think that being able to create opportunities for farm workers to be able to, you know, like step into a new industry and to be able to have access to these really great jobs that will be created. And so starting off in community colleges and earlier on education, I think is one way to be able to meet communities earlier on in the process.
Great. Eddie, Jana, other thoughts?
Yeah, it could be any number of, just to focus again on workforce development policy. So Brightline runs like a transitional age youth program, so ages 17 through 24, youth essentially who are not college bound, wanting to go into the unionized construction trades is the focus. And it could be any number of issues, lack of driver's license, needing to complete a GED or high school, you know, have their high school diploma ready, language, you know, having, if for instance they're from a monolingual speaking community, in the Bay Area, it could be Spanish, Tagalog, any number of things, but just making sure that they have the ability to transition in a field that may be primarily English speaking is important. So there are a lot of nuances, and oftentimes it depends on the community, and what, you know, those barriers are will be determined by the locality itself.
I just want to follow up on what you said about housing, because in Humboldt, housing is an issue that we hear all the time. The average household income is $53,000 roughly, and I just looked it up. The average home price is $400,000 now.
Wow.
And so, you know, that doesn't match up. There are times where you can go on Zillow, which I surf, and there's no housing stock in Arcata. I mean, there's nothing on the market. So there are smart people working on this really hard. And I think that when we talk about this needing a whole of government, private, you know, public-private partnership approach, that these regions see the opportunity, they're cautious about the impacts, and in the middle, we need the resources to be able to mobilize on these kinds of issues, and without it, we risk souring it. You know, the developers have done a great job of articulating like project risk. The regions see the risks in a different way. The risk is the exploitation, the extraction, not having the wraparound supports, the housing, the healthcare, the childcare. Exactly. And we've had amazing catalytic investment by philanthropy in our region for the first time that is at least getting the leading edge of the engagement piece around this. But I'll give you an example that I was just talking about with a colleague earlier. So the port, $1 billion project. To date, $11 million has been committed to planning for that port. Now, that isn't a match. Right. If you want things done in a way that that creates, you know, community engagement and community benefit, and really doing the deep engineering and design work to get to zero emission all electric up front, we need to be better resourced for capacity across the board. So, and we're not even to really the intense permitting phases yet. Right. And I think, lastly, I just want to say one thing, that the old adage used to be, well, you know, you increase engagement and you delay, you know, you increase the timeline. I think engagement has never been properly resourced. What we're seeing is when people get engaged with the proper resources, it leads to a sense of agency and a sense of knowledge around what's happening around them, and it feels like it's happening with them and not to them. We heard this from many tribal nations earlier today. This has never been properly done. So we have the opportunity to do that, but it is going to take state and federal resources to be able to do it well.
Actually, a fantastic transition as we're thinking sort of our wrapping up the last few minutes. Are there model policies and ideas, sort of key pieces of policy that need to be considered in sort of the offshore wind processes? I'll leave that open. So whether state level, federal level, that can really sort of centralize the justice principle, as well as, and I think this engagement piece is key on making sure that it's properly funded and that people have the capacity to engage versus just trying to sort of survive through everyday life. We need to make that space for folks. How do you all think about, what is the message, right, to state and federal agencies really driving this industry? How can they help support those opportunities?
So very interested on what's going on in the East Coast and community benefits agreements, for instance, as they're published and available, to be able to replicate some of that on the West Coast, I think could be really good. You know, if we're ending with like final thoughts, I was thinking through like, we've also been looking at litigation and what's going on as these projects potentially get jammed up at the last minute. Some of it's quite crazy. There's one, I'm probably getting in trouble for talking about this, but there's one fascinating case where essentially a solar developer has sued an offshore wind project, claiming standing based on, for instance, seeing a whale, you know, from a Ritz-Carlton hotel off, the coast of Florida. It's, you know, almost something out of a James Bond movie, like a villain essentially, you know, in his own mind, saving the world, but also, you know, managing to destroy, you know, things along the process. But the reason why I share that is that at the end of the day, I think a lot about like what offshore wind will mean for us as, you know, essentially the world and as communities 20 years from now. And a lot of it, you know, nobody likes to be the villain in their own story. No one writes that kind of narrative. And that I think the question I hope everybody asks themselves is, as we go forward and work on this together, who am I accountable to? Who are the communities that I'm accountable to as these projects push through? And that way, I think the community benefits conversation is really important.
Yeah, I think that this is just so exciting, and it's like really great to think about, like, you know, it's going to do all of these amazing things and the opportunities that come with building a completely new industry and creating a process and being able to create all of these partnerships. It's really exciting, and I think at the same time, we have to remember that there are going to be impacts. There's going to be impacts on land, there's going to be impacts on water, there's going to be impacts on habitat, and that's something that we can do right this time, is to put that first and to problem solve before, and to do that with equity centered and with people and health centered. It's like it's time to break the cycle of like the fossil fuel economy and correct the harms that have been done, and you know, really thinking about like who's going to be really impacted by this. The first thing that comes to mind is like portside communities are going to continue to bear a big burden of pollution from diesel trucking, from land being used for significant storage that's needed to store all of this infrastructure. And so for me, like the first thing that comes to mind is like, how are we going to mitigate that pollution that is going to come with offshore wind? It's a clean energy, but like the development and the manufacturing of it is going to be polluting, and we can't forget that, and we absolutely can't forget the people that are going to be impacted by that, and that's where we need to start those conversations about community benefits and the people that we need to be accountable to.
Jana, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, just really quickly, you know, in April, the average daily global surface temperature of the ocean went above 21 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 70 degrees, for the first time ever, well, since they've been keeping records in 1981, but the temperature of the ocean is already off the charts. Fossil fuels got us there on the main, and the scientists are looking at this. Tribal scientists, other scientists are looking at this with, as you might imagine, an extreme sense of urgency about what this means for us. We've seen dramatic heat events over the last 5 years that are really unprecedented. We know all this is creating extremely volatile and unpredictable situations for all of us. So I think within that context, offshore wind does have significant opportunity to move the needle, and we need to do it well. And I think talking with people at this conference, talking with people in our region, everyone is thinking along those same lines.
Yep.
And so there's optimism that it will be done well if it's done and where it's done. So it gives one a sense of hope.
I think I can echo that, and having spent 16 years, I guess, in renewable energy, offshore wind is the first, in the conversation surrounding it, the first time I'm really seeing sort of at scale opportunities to, one, move the needle on climate, but the key conversations that are being driven at the state level by stakeholders at the federal level are conversations I have never seen had around energy development in the past. Do we still have a lot of things to watch out for to try to get it right? Absolutely, but I echo that, Jana, that I think we have room for optimism, and all of the people in this audience and a lot of the conversations I have had to date in offshore wind are echoing sort of that other people are saying this as well. It's just much more mainstream conversation on how we do this development, which makes me really, really hopeful. And seeing all of you folks and your organization sort of continuing to drive this, I think we have some room for optimism, but let's keep listening and let's keep making sure engaging in the way that we're doing. So I really appreciate, I think we're going to wrap up, but so much appreciate your participation and time, and please everyone give this fantastic panel a great round of applause. Great.